20 years ago, American pop culture was once again in transition, and I, like many others, became swept away by the fun of the soon-to-be classic Clueless. I was tickled by the naughty irony, the dramatic fashion, the silliness, and the on-the-point characters. As a young book nerd, I would soon follow up this by reading Emma, completely unwittingly realizing on a chat on AOL, am I dating myself, that they were in fact one and the same story. But the real joy of this movie, aside from its 90s candy fashion, tongue-in-cheek slang, and giving the world Paul Rudd, is that it stands up not just to a generation of young women who were once again given a satirical and smart lessons of Austen's Emma, but a well-intentioned club to help us transition into adulthood. Our author, Chaney, has been an astute observer of pop culture, publishing, and music and film reviews, features and essays and venues including Esquire, New York, the Washington Post, and Yahoo.com. On its anniversary, Chaney interviewed a wide array of artists and culture makers influenced by Clueless. In As If, she chronicles the creation of this movie, the director and screenwriter Amy Heckerling's work to adapt the film, get it made, and the delicious details of casting, costumes, and music choices along the way. Please join me in welcoming Jan Chaney.
Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for coming today. I'm really excited to see all of you all here for the book and also to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this movie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the film, sharing some anecdotes that I found out as far as when I was doing my research. Then I'm going to open it up for questions from you guys. And if there is time, we will be playing Clueless trivia. If some of you are brave enough to volunteer, I have game show buzzers, and there are prizes involved. So hopefully we can get that in as well. But I wanted to start out just by kind of having us all flash back to 1995, if we can. And right around this time in 1995, in July, that's when Clueless first opened in theaters. It was released on July 19th, a Wednesday. And it was a movie that was made for around $13 million and ended up making $56.6 million just in North America in theaters, which is not a huge amount of money, but when you translate that into contemporary dollars, at least according to Box Office Mojo's data, that's more than $100 million. So for a modestly budgeted film, that's a pretty good return, not to mention that it also made money, obviously, on DVD sales, merchandising, other things down the line. But I think what's really important about Clueless is less how much money it made and more the ripple effects and the response that it has engendered over 20 years. So in 1995, if you go back 10 years prior, teen movies, high school movies, there were so many of them. And interestingly, I would say at the front end of the 80s teen movie wave was another Amy Heckerling film, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which came out in 1982. And then there were so many others, obviously all the John Hughes movies, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, Heathers, Say Anything. There were just many of these kinds of movies being made. And then in the early 90s, there was really kind of a drop-off, at least in terms of mainstream cinema and having teen and high school movies. It's not like there were no movies being made about the teenage experience, but most of them were either independent or just didn't really have the kind of impact that the movies in the 80s did. So for a little while, there wasn't really anything quite like this. And I think a lot of people didn't necessarily expect Clueless to be the hit that it was because we hadn't seen a teen movie do this well in such a long time. And what happened as a result, Clueless did well. And then the following year, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet did very well, appealing to a teen audience. And then you had Scream, which was a huge hit at the end of 96. And if you look at by the end of the 90s, if you look at the movie release schedule for like 1999, it was like every weekend there was a teen movie coming out because that population was growing. They were clearly spending money on movie tickets, and Hollywood suddenly wanted to serve them. Sometimes there were great movies like Election or Bring It On, and sometimes they weren't so great, but there were a lot more of those movies out there, and I think Clueless was really at the front end of making that happen again. Obviously, the fashion was very important in this movie. People really responded to, especially obviously girls, young women, to the costumes, and they wanted to dress like Cher and Ty and Dion to the point where executives at Bloomingdale's felt like they were caught flat-footed by the movie's success. They didn't have enough over-the-knee, stockings and plaid skirts to meet the demand initially. And over the years, a lot of fashion designers. I mean, this movie references designers, Calvin Klein, Alaya, but designers who really love the movie have then been inspired in some of their own designs over the past 10 years or so to replicate things and sort of riff on what was in the movie. And then, of course, there's this movie's quotability. Amy Heckerling wrote this film. She has always been sort of a student of language, and she keeps her own sort of slang dictionary. But she also pulled from all kinds of different resources when she was writing this script. The UCLA slang dictionary. She went and did research at high schools and listened to how the kids in high school were talking. Hip hop music, all kinds of different places. And so this sort of sophisticated Heckerling version of Val speak that's in this movie, then people actually started talking like that, and I think it really permeated our lexicon. You know, people started saying as if, whatever with a W. That became a thing. You know, it's my feeling that if someone says something mean to you, the only proper response is, that's way harsh, Ty. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. And then I think a lot of the appeal of this, too, is that it's based on a timeless story, as Hannah mentioned, Emma, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary, or this is celebrating its 20th. This is Emma celebrating its 200th anniversary. It was first published in 1815 this year. And you could watch Clueless and not know that it was based on Emma and still enjoy it. In fact, Paul Rudd told me that at one point early on in production, one of the producers said, "Hey, isn't it great that this is based on Emma?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's really awesome." And inside he's like, "I had no idea this was based on Emma." And I think a lot of people didn't either. But once you know that information and you watch the movie having read Emma, it just adds a whole layer of enjoyment to Clueless. And I think, again, that's narrative arc in the way that Amy Heckerling took it and made it relevant to contemporary, at the time, 1995. It speaks to what a timeless story that Jane Austen wrote back in the 1800s. And then I think that this is just a basic kind of coming-of-age story in a lot of ways about a girl trying to figure out her place in the world and realizing that she's kind of been underestimating herself. Taylor Burney, who's a producer for the Kojo Namdi show, wrote something about my book recently. And in describing Clueless, she said it really speaks to what I think is a universal plight for young women, their desire to be taken seriously. And so I think, you know, as much as this is a fun movie and the fashion's great and the music's great, there's also some deeper things that connected with people, I think. So as far as the book goes, I started working on this book not very long ago. It was about a year ago. It was last summer. And I was really writing it because we knew we wanted it to come out in conjunction with the 20th anniversary, because we knew there'd be a lot of cultural conversation around that, and it just seemed like the right time. So I was on an accelerated timetable to get it done. My initial manuscript was written in about 6 months. Like I said, I started last summer. It was due right after the holidays, so Christmas was super fun at my house. And then I had 3 months or so after that going through the edits, adding new information from interviews I got sort of at the 11th hour and threading those through the book. But still, 9 months for a book like this, for all the people I had to talk to, it was kind of a 9-month long panic attack with brief, intervals of calm. But it worked out, and I think, you know, it was great to talk to Amy Heckerling, who obviously I talked to more than anybody else because this was her baby from the beginning. But what I really enjoyed actually was finding people who haven't really had an opportunity to talk about Clueless and to have their a spotlight shine on what they brought to the movie. So people who were in the cast, maybe who played smaller roles, people who were behind the scenes who did a lot for the movie, but aren't necessarily always in, Entertainment Weekly profiles about the movie. So people like Bill Pope, who was the director of photography, who's a great, really articulate guy. He was also the director of photography for the Matrix movies, for Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, just, a really accomplished guy. Herb Hall, there is an actual Mr. Hall, who Amy Heckerling sat in on one of his classes at Beverly Hills High. He was a speech teacher. So when she was writing the screenplay, she based Mr. Hall. She named it after Herb. And Herb is also in the movie because he was an actor on the side in addition to being a teacher, like everyone in LA, I guess. When Ty comes to gym class when they're playing tennis for the first time and the principal walks in and says, "This is Ty Frazier," the principal of Bronson Alcott High School is Herb Hall. And then Jace Alexander, who plays the mugger in the movie, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All these people were just really fun to talk to, and I really hadn't seen their stories about this movie being told before. And some of them, were not in the industry anymore, so I had to find people's sisters, brothers, spouses, whoever I could, and sort of track people down. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the sort of fun facts, interesting things that I found out, but not all of the interesting things, because I want you guys to have something to read. For those who don't know the history behind this movie, initially Amy Heckerling wrote this as a TV pilot that was supposed to be about the in crowd at a high school. And it was going to be a TV show for Fox, which those of you who are old enough to remember they were doing well with a show called Beverly Hills 90210 at the time. And so she wrote this pilot, and ultimately Fox decided they didn't really want to do it as a TV show, and she was kind of depressed. She talked to her agent, Ken Stovitz, about this, and he said, I think this could maybe be a movie. Maybe you should try to rethink this and write it as a one-off, theatrical feature. That's when she went back to Emma and reread Emma and found, oh my gosh, this is a perfect narrative structure for a contemporary high school movie. And at that point, Fox was still going to make it just as a movie, but then some of the executives at Fox didn't quite get what Amy was trying to do, and they were making suggestions like, maybe it shouldn't be so much about one girl, and maybe it should be more about the boys, and maybe it should be more of an ensemble thing, which takes it farther away from Emma, certainly, and farther away from what Heckerling was trying to do. Ultimately, Fox ended up putting it in Turnaround, which gave her the opportunity to shop it around Hollywood and find someone else to make it, and tons of studios, tons of producers turned it down until ultimately Scott Rudin wanted to make it exactly as she had envisioned it, and it ended up being at Paramount. But another thing that some of the executives at Fox had an issue with was what they thought was the incestuous nature of the relationship between Cher and Josh. Because, Josh is her ex-stepbrother. Josh's mom was married to Cher's father for a brief period of time. We don't know exactly how long. And obviously that was sort of, again, coming from Emma, where Mr. Knightley and Emma have known each other really since Emma was practically a baby, and Mr. Knightley is the brother of her brother-in-law, so I think that was where that kind of came from. But the other thing I found out is that it was also based on Amy Heckerling's actual grandparents, who were step-siblings. They became step-siblings when they were teenagers, and so I'm just going to read a little snippet of that's in the book of her talking about this. My grandmother was a teenager, and she had an older stepbrother, totally not blood related. When I was a kid, all she did was complain about her stepmother to me, her evil stepmother, and how mean she was to her, and would hide her in the closet when the social worker came, so she wasn't sent to school and she could be kept at home to do the cleaning. But her stepbrother, whom she later married, was always a protector. They were married. They knew each other from the time they were teenagers. He was almost 100 when he died. She was in her late 80s. So they were fighting for like 80 years. I mean, fighting. But when one got sick, they were completely lost. They were so dependent on each other and so angry all the time with each other. Anyhow, they cracked me up, so it did not seem like a crazy thing to me for Josh and Cher to be together. So I thought that was interesting that it also came from Heckerling's personal life to some degree. And then another interesting part of this was learning more and more about the casting process. Because as I mentioned, initially this movie was at Fox. So they started the casting process at Fox with a casting director named Carrie Fraser. And then obviously it didn't work out at Fox. They moved to Paramount, and then the casting started again at Paramount. Some of the people who auditioned when it was at Fox also auditioned again at Paramount. But Alicia Silverstone was really attached as Cher once the project left Fox. But even though, Amy Heckerling knew she wanted Alicia Silverstone for that part, she had seen her in the Aerosmith video, she had met her, she felt very strongly that she was Cher, the studio still wanted her to meet other people and audition other people. And so one person that she met with was Reese Witherspoon. Reese Witherspoon never read for the part, but they had a meeting, and Amy Heckerling liked her a lot, but she already felt like she had her share. Carrie Fraser really liked Ben Affleck for the role of Josh, which is the role that Paul Rudd ultimately played. Amy never actually saw him read. I think that was purely Carrie seeing him and being kind of interested in him for that part. But obviously, once it went to Paramount, that sort of went out the window. So at Paramount, the casting director's name was Marcia Ross, and Marcia Ross did not throw out any of her notes from this time period. She didn't want to, email them to me or fax them because she was afraid of them, getting leaked out or something. But she read at great length from them all these names. And again, some of these people didn't actually come in and read or audition, but they were just part of the conversation. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But it was just fascinating hearing all these names. So for Josh Charles, who probably many of you know from The Good Wife and Dead Poets Society, he was somebody who was potentially up for Josh. Henry Thomas, who played Elliot in E.T., auditioned for Josh. For Travis, they were considering Jeremy Renner, who is now an Avenger. They were considering Johnny Galecki from The Big Bang Theory. Seth Green was really close in the running, and he's actually Breckin Meyer's. Travis is the role played by Breckin Meyer. He's Breckin Meyer's best friend, so they were kind of competing against each other for that. And then for the role of Amber, they actually offered that originally to Sarah Michelle Gellar, who really wanted to do it, and she was on All My Children at the time. And the people at All My Children would not let her out of her contract, would not allow her the time that she needed to go and film this movie. So unfortunately, she didn't get to play the part, but fortunately for Elisa Donovan, she got to be cast as Amber. But my favorite one is Dave Chappelle, because Amy Heckerling had seen this movie Men in Tights, and she thought Dave Chappelle was really funny. And she asked Mel Brooks about him. Mel Brooks directed that film, and got in touch with Dave Chappelle and had like a meal with him or drinks or something like that. And actually Wallace Shawn, who's really good friends with Amy Heckerling and also plays Mr. Hall, he came along. So first of all, I just like the idea of that, like Amy Heckerling, Dave Chappelle, Wallace Shawn hanging out. And then what she ultimately decided was she thought Chappelle was hilarious and great, but that he was too edgy for what she needed Murray to be doing. She said Murray is supposed to be sort of like a puppy dog, and Donald Faison is a puppy dog. I think that was probably the right call. Nevertheless, I really would like to see a version of Clueless with Dave Chappelle in it, just out of my own curiosity. Another casting story that I thought was fascinating and one of my favorite stories in the book involves Jace Alexander, the guy who plays the mugger who holds Cher up at gunpoint and doesn't know what an Elia is. So originally that role was supposed to be played by another actor. In fact, the same actor who, for those of you who know Fast Times, at the end of the movie, Judge Reinhold gets held up and Spicoli bursts out of the bathroom and saves the day. And the guy who holds up Judge Reinhold was supposed to play the mugger in Clueless. But he couldn't get to the set on time that day, so he got fired. And he got fired the day of, like hours before they were supposed to shoot. So there was a mad scramble to find somebody to hold up Alicia Silverstone at gunpoint. And it just so happened that the day before, Jace Alexander, who had been acting for a long time, he was trying to sort of transition at that point into directing and producing. He also happens to be the son of Jane Alexander, who is an excellent actress and was also the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts under Bill Clinton at the same time that Clueless was made. He had a meeting with Scott Rudin the day before the mugging scene was shot about a project totally unrelated to Clueless that he was working on. And he has played muggers before on many occasions for some reason. And so when this all happened, I think a light bulb went off in Scott Rudin's mind. I'm just going to read from Jace Alexander's words as he explained to me this whole story. And I just want to say that he called me, and I prefaced our interview. I said, I know I'm asking you about something from 20 years ago. I understand if some of the memories are fuzzy. He's like, no, I remember everything. And then he just talked for like 15 minutes straight. So he says, we had a very good meeting, referring to Rudin, and the next day I was driving in the valley doing some sort of business related to my thesis film, editorial or something like that, and my pager went off. This is back when people had pagers. It was a number I didn't recognize, so I stopped, and I think I had a cell phone back then, one of those big Motorola things that looks like a toy now. And I called the number, and the person on the other end went, Scott Rudin's office. My heart literally jumped out of my chest, because at that moment I thought that meant that he was interested in this script, in this movie. I was so excited I can't tell you. I said, this is Jace Alexander. And she goes, hold please for Scott Rudin. I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And Scott gets on the other line and he goes, Jace? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, kind of a strange question, but what are you doing tonight? And my heart sank. It was an odd thing to say, and it clearly had nothing to do with the script, and his tone was, I couldn't read it. I said, well, actually, and I was telling the truth, I'm directing a play at the Mark Taper Forum second stage, and it's a one-woman show, and it's the second night of only 3 nights, and I kind of feel like I should be there. And he goes, oh, really? Huh. And I said, well, what's up? And he goes, well, my friend Amy Heckerling is doing this little movie, and we lost an actor, and I thought of you. And like my mind was reeling. I could not grasp what he was saying because this kind of thing just isn't really ever said to anybody. I said, I'm so sorry. What? What are you saying? And he goes, well, she's shooting a movie and we lost this actor and I wanted to see, but if you're busy. And I said, well, no, hold on one second. So I said, well, where is it shooting? He said, in the valley. And I was in the valley. I said, well, when would she need me? And he said, well, like now. Like now? He goes, yeah, the scene's shooting in a couple hours. And I said, well, where are they shooting? And he said the address was just like Victory Boulevard and something, where that liquor store in the movie is. I looked up where I was. I had no idea where I had pulled over. I was literally less than half a mile from the location. Just happenstance. I said, okay, I think yes. So there's more to it than that. There's more in the book where he talks about getting to set and sort of being thrust into the scene and meeting Alicia Silverstone and it all happening so fast. And to this day, he gets recognized on a daily basis for holding up Alicia Silverstone at gunpoint. But I just love the idea that he was just right there, just half a mile away from where he needed to be. Speaking of muggings, another interesting story that I learned involves Paul Rudd. While production was going on, one night Paul Rudd went out to dinner with a friend, and he was held up at gunpoint. But it wasn't as funny as it is in Clueless. So I'm going to just read, again, these are Paul Rudd's words. I was at Jerry's Deli with a friend of mine. We were having dinner, and there were these policemen sitting next to us, and I told her, it must be really hard to be a cop in L.A. It's got to be the hardest place to be a policeman. She said, New York must be hard. I said, yeah, but it seems like everything's contained. If anyone did anything, you can't get away quickly. So we were having this conversation. Anyway, I was going out to my car after we finished dinner, and a guy jumped out and put a gun to my head and demanded that I give him all my money. And I didn't really have any money on me. He goes, you don't think this is a real gun? He was all tweaked out on something, and he shot his gun next to my head. And I just remember looking out of the corner of my eye, and my friend had gone back inside. She saw what was happening to get those policemen. She did, but it was too late. Then they went to try and chase him, but they couldn't find him. It was a weird premonition. It was a strange kind of conversation, but I didn't have any money, and so I said, look, man, I've just got my backpack. You can have it. He's like rifling around by my car, and he just grabs my backpack. The only thing that was in it was I had a Discman and my script, my Clueless script that had all of my notes and everything in it. Those were the only two things he got. Then I remember having to go to work the next day, and it was all a bit of a delayed reaction. I remember thinking, whoa, that was really crazy. A guy shot a gun next to my head, and now here I am like 10 hours later, dancing. Because the next day he was shooting the scene where they're all at the party, where Christian and Cher go to the party, and he's talking to a grown-up, the only person, of course, who would do that at a party. So there were two things about that struck me. One, we came dangerously close to losing Paul Rudd, and let's just all have a moment of silence about that, because that would have been horrible on many, many levels. And then secondly, you know, the fact that there is a hold-up scene in the movie, and this happened to him, not all that far away from where it was in the film, and which speaks to the real disconnect between what LA life is like in Clueless versus what it's like in real life. It's not quite the same. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then two more things I just wanted to tell you guys about. One of the things that I just became very fixated on, little tiny details about the movie and trying to find out what the stories were behind them. And there were two in particular. Well, there were more than two. I got very fixated on the fuzzy pens and finding out the story behind the fuzzy pens, which I did find out, but as it turns out, it's not that interesting of a story, so we took it out of the book. It's like they got pens, they embellished the pens, and then they're in the movie. There was not much to it. But the painting of Cher's mother that hangs in the foyer of their house, I don't know if you guys remember that. There's a point where she walks in and she shows her mother, her late mother, who died in a tragic liposuction accident, her grade on a test. And I was very interested in who could have possibly painted this portrait. So I started by asking the production designer, Stephen Jordan, because he oversees all of that kind of thing. He couldn't remember. I asked the set decorator, Amy Wells. She couldn't remember. I asked the prop master. It's not really a prop, but I thought, well, maybe he knows. He had no idea. And I had asked tons of people. And then finally I thought, well, I'll just ask Amy Heckerling. I doubt this tiny detail was even on her radar, but maybe she might remember. And so I said, Amy, do you remember who painted that picture of Cher's mom? She's like, oh yeah, that's my friend Victor. And so it turns out that one of Amy's friends from high school, she went to like an art and design school in Manhattan, and he was a great artist and still a friend of hers, she commissioned him to paint this, I think she referred to it as like a disco portrait of Cher's mom. They gave him a picture of Alicia Silverstone to work with. He did it, I think, in like a week. It was a very, very quick turnaround, and it ended up in the movie. And in case you're wondering where it is, it's in Amy Heckerling's garage. So I love that story. And then the other story that I was really, my mystery that I was trying to get solved that unfortunately still is not solved, is I had written a piece for Vulture that was just an oral history of the Party in the Valley scene, which is really what got this whole book going. And when I talked to Amy Heckerling as part of that process, she remembered that there's a scene during the Val party, or portion of the Val party, where Cher goes outside. She's talking on her cell phone, telling her dad she's going to be home, pretty soon. And she's standing next to a swimming pool. Well, if you look closely at what's going on in the background, in the pool, there's a couple making out sort of in the foreground, behind the guy who's throwing up. So Amy and some of the assistant directors, they had to ask two of the extras if they would be willing to kiss in the pool. And apparently you get paid extra money for that because you have to be in the pool and get wet. So they had to make sure it was okay. This is according to like Screen Actors Guild regulations. So a guy and a girl volunteered to do it, and they shot the scene. And then I don't know if it was a year or 2 years later, Amy wasn't exactly sure, but this couple came up to her on the street and they're like, "Oh, Amy." And it was this couple from the pool who were now engaged to be married. So they had met kissing in the Clueless pool, which I just thought was fantastic. And I was determined to find out who they were. So I asked everybody. I asked both the ADs, I asked Amy, I asked Bill Pope, I eventually talked to the guy who was in charge of casting the extras, and he couldn't remember. And I had the production reports, which are basically sort of like a diary of where they were shooting every day, who was on set when they arrived, when they left. But since they didn't have speaking parts, they weren't necessarily named on there. So I was never able to find out who they were. I posted something on social media even, thinking maybe they'll see it, maybe someone who knows them will see it. I just want to know if they are still married. That's all I want to know. Since the movie ends with a wedding, I just thought it would be so great if there was an actual Clueless wedding, and I never got to find that out, but hopefully one day I will. So with that, I want to open it up to you guys if you guys have questions to ask me, and if you don't, then we'll play trivia.